Hi everyone, this is Sean with the Privacy Technical Assistance Center, also known as PTAC. Thank you for joining us today for the FERPA and Virtual Learning During COVID-19 webinar. This is a reminder that everyone will be muted during today's webinar. Due to the number of attendees, we will not be able to take live questions. However, if you do have any further questions, please direct them to ferpa@ed.gov or by phone at 855-249-3072. Today's webinar will be recorded, and the recording of this webinar will be made available on the department's Student Privacy Policy Office website at https://studentprivacy.ed.gov. With that, I'm going to turn this over to the Acting Director of the Student Privacy Policy Office, Kala Serpanath. Kala?
Thank you, Sean. Before we get started, I wanted to say a few thank yous. As Acting Director of the Student Privacy Policy Office, wife of a public school teacher, and a parent of 3 sons, I want to thank you for your work to support our students during this time of unprecedented disruption. Providing online or virtual education services is important in maintaining continuity and a sense of some routine for many, if not all, of our students. I also want to thank our education partners and our educators who are on the front lines of serving our students and are learning as we all are in this new world. I want to thank parents and students who are actively involved in supporting this move to virtual learning. And finally, I want to thank the many who submitted the questions that we will address today regarding FERPA and student privacy. We appreciate your input. With that brief note of gratitude, I will turn to our presentation today. FERPA is the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act. The FERPA statute is codified at 20 U.S.C. 1232G, and it was enacted in the 1970s. It is more than 45 years old. When it was enacted, computers and virtual learning were not even thought of at the time. The FERPA regulations are codified in 34 CFR Part 99, which is the Code of Federal Regulations. They were last amended in 2011. We at the Student Privacy Policy Office, or SPPO, at the U.S. Department of Education are responsible for implementing FERPA, including establishing policy and investigating complaints under FERPA. The Student Privacy Policy Office and our Privacy Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC, are also available to provide technical assistance on FERPA and related issues. Our office was formerly known as the Family Policy Compliance Office, or FPCO, which is often the name that you'll see referred to in our regulation. I am joined today by Ross Lemke, Director of PTAC. PTAC has helped us collect many questions that we have received from all of you. We here at SPPO have distilled these questions into the 10 scenarios that we will discuss today in the handout, which will also be available on our website following the presentation. After each of these 10 scenarios, there are specific takeaway lessons under FERPA that I will discuss. In addition, we will pose some questions for you to consider as you move forward. What is FERPA? FERPA is a federal law that applies to educational agencies and institutions and applicable programs that are funded by the U.S. Department of Education. FERPA provides parents and eligible students with 3 basic important rights. 1, the right to access education records and to seek amendment of those education records for specific purposes. 2, what is thought of as the most important right, which is the right of privacy, or the right to provide consent to the disclosure of personally identifiable information, or PII, from the education records of students unless a specific FERPA exception applies. And 3, the right to file a complaint under FERPA. Please note there's a tiny footnote at the bottom of this slide which refers to an eligible student. And that is because FERPA applies to both school districts and public schools at the elementary and secondary level, as well as public and private institutions of post-secondary education. FERPA rights transfer at age 18, and so an eligible student also has rights. An eligible student is defined as someone over the age of 18 or enrolled in a post-secondary institution. This webinar is intended to cover some of the issues about FERPA and virtual learning. During this webinar, we will address some of the common questions we have received about FERPA under the current circumstances during COVID-19. We will also discuss privacy and security best practices, which, while not required, we recommend, as well as identify at the very end some additional resources that are available. Virtual learning. What is this brave new world? In this era, we are now going from the brick and mortar classroom to the computer or the smartphone in the home environment. Moving education from the school to the home presents many challenges. Privacy is just one of those challenges. Our presentation today is really limited to the issues of student privacy under FERPA. This move to virtual learning also presents opportunities. As my husband, who is a school teacher, has found, there are opportunities for more individualized learning, providing opportunities for students to learn at their own pace, the opportunity to build more independent learners, and the opportunity to find day-to-day application of instruction as students are in their home environment. How does FERPA come into play during this time of virtual learning? There are probably about 6 issues that we have most commonly addressed in the questions we have received. The first is FERPA's school official exception, which is an exception to the general requirement to obtain prior written consent before disclosing PII from education records. We will talk about what it is and how it works in the virtual learning environment. A second issue that we are commonly discussing with schools and parents are the use of video and other forms of instruction, whether that's email, group chat, teleconferences. The third issue that is very common is the importance of defining education records and identifying PII in student education records. We've also received a few questions on the timeline for accessing education records, as well as questions on whether or not FERPA's written consent requirement can be electronic. And finally, when all of this started, which seemed long ago but was less than perhaps just a couple of months ago, we issued in early March 2020 a frequently asked questions, or FAQ document, on the health or safety emergency exception under FERPA. And I will highlight that at the end of the presentation in terms of the availability of that as a resource, but there is still one question that we're receiving under that document. With that, I ask Ross of our Privacy Technical Assistance Center to describe the first scenario.
I'm a college professor or a public school teacher and need information about my students on hand while I switch to virtual instruction. Can I take home with me personally identifiable information from my students' education records?
Thank you, Rob. And the answer is yes. FERPA does not prohibit teachers from taking PII, or personally identifiable information, from the education records of students home with them, as long as the teacher has a legitimate educational interest in the education records, as determined by their educational agency or institution. School officials, including teachers, who take education records home are prohibited from further disclosing the PII from the education records, except as otherwise permitted under FERPA. In addition, they should use reasonable methods to protect those education records and the PII in those records from further disclosure. Those protections can include access controls that are physical, technological, and administrative controls. Some of the questions that you may want to consider are what are the kinds of education records or PII from education records that school officials will be taking home? Well, what format will they be in? Will they be electronic or hard copies? And how will they be brought home? Are there electronic transfers? Are there thumb drives? And how will the school official or teacher secure that PII in those education records while those records are at home?
Our school is planning to use video conferencing or other virtual learning software applications to hold classes virtually. Can a school or district use such applications under FERPA?
Yes, and I apologize for the very small font on the slide. The applicable exception under FERPA that would permit such a disclosure is the school official exception to FERPA's general consent requirement. Under this exception, educational agencies and institutions may disclose students' education records or the PII in those records to a provider of such a service as long as the provider meets the 4 requirements for the school official exception. This includes 1, performing an institutional service or function for which that educational agency or institution would otherwise use its own employees. 2, meeting the school official criteria in the school's annual notification of FERPA rights. 3, ensuring that the provider is under the direct control of the educational agency or institution. And 4, ensuring that the use of the education records, or PII, is only for authorized purposes and does not redisclose PII unless there's some specific FERPA exception or separate authorization under FERPA. There's some additional considerations. While FERPA does not require an educational agency or institution to enter into an agreement with the provider under the school official exception, it is a best practice. In particular, it would be helpful in such an agreement to clarify and identify the issues of direct control, the purposes for which that information is being shared, so that to establish the legitimate educational interest. The school's annual notification of FERPA rights includes its criteria for determining who constitutes a school official and what constitutes a legitimate educational interest. At the bottom of that slide, you will see links to the Student Privacy Policy Office's website, which includes the model annual notification of FERPA rights. But to find your own school notification, you would look on your school's website or for your school's information. Some questions to consider in this scenario are, does your educational agency or institution currently allow a particular type of software? Some schools are finding that they have existing software in place that can be expanded to be used for virtual learning during this time. A second question to consider is, what is your agency or institution's process to review requests for software if you're looking at establishing some new relationships? And finally, we direct you to some of the resources that we had shared earlier, 2 documents in particular, one entitled Protecting Student Privacy While Using Online Education Services, which identifies some of the common questions and provisions you may want to include in an agreement with a provider, and a second document, which is a data security checklist. Both of these documents highlight the types of terms of service that you may want to consider.
Does FERPA address which apps can be used?
No, FERPA is a privacy rule. It does not include explicit information security standards. Under FERPA, educational agencies and institutions may disclose without consent education records or PII in those records to the providers of online learning or virtual apps under the school official exception, provided they meet the conditions of that exception. Schools and school districts should work with their information security officers and attorneys to review the information security requirements and terms of service. As I mentioned, FERPA does not address the use of specific applications. By contrast, HIPAA, which is an abbreviation for the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act of 1996, has a number of rules. It has a privacy rule, and it also has a separate information security rule. HIPAA also has an explicit statutory waiver provision under Section 1135 of the Social Security Act. FERPA does not have a comparable statutory waiver authority. One of the reasons we, I believe, have been receiving this question under FERPA is that the agency that administers the federal HIPAA privacy and security rules is the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services Office of Civil Rights. That office issued notices recently under HIPAA and identified some apps that represent that they are compliant with the HIPAA information security rule to provide telehealth services, provided that there is an appropriate business associate agreement under HIPAA. In those notices, HHS identified 3 apps that are public-facing videos that would not meet HIPAA's information security standards and would not be compliant. Those 3 apps also would not work under FERPA as if they are truly public-facing, because they would not meet even the reasonable standards for privacy protection.
Can non-students observe a virtual lesson? What information about students might be disclosed during the virtual classroom time?
So as the virtual learning occurs in the home environment, there may be individuals who pass by and are seen perhaps on the video screen who are not actually participating in the lesson. Assuming that during the virtual lesson, PII from student education records is not disclosed, FERPA would not prohibit a non-student from observing the lesson. As you know, in our 2003 letter to Manus, our office has indicated when observing a classroom in a brick-and-mortar traditional classroom, the local school can determine who is able to participate or view or observe a classroom. And that was premised on the very common fact that most teachers during instruction do not typically reveal personally identifiable information from student education records, other than to say a student's name. I wanted to highlight another less-known provision of our FERPA regulations, and that includes our directory information exception. Under the directory information exception, specific information that is designated as directory information by the school permits certain PII or personally identifiable information from education records to be disclosed during classroom instruction to students who are enrolled in or attending the class. Indeed, there's a very small provision, not as well known, that even though under the directory information exception, a parent or an eligible student may opt out of the directory information that it can be disclosed, that opt-out is not applicable for the classroom instruction and for the disclosure of the student's name, identifier, or institutional email address in which the class that the student's enrolled in. In general, as a best practice, educational agencies and institutions should discourage non-students from observing virtual classrooms in the event that PII from a student's education record is in fact disclosed in such virtual classrooms. Typically for our younger students in the K-12 world, that would not include parents who may be participating in assisting students in that context. Schools may wish to include instructions for students participating in the virtual classroom regarding not sharing or recording any PII from education records that may be disclosed in the virtual classroom, or consider obtaining prior written consent to permit such sharing of PII from education records. Ross?
Due to our transition from holding in-person classes to virtual lessons, is it permissible to record classes and share the recording of the virtual classes to students who are unable to attend?
Yes, assuming the video recording does not disclose PII from student education records during a virtual classroom lesson, or appropriate written consent is obtained if PII from the education record is disclosed, FERPA would not prohibit a teacher from making a recording of the lesson available to students enrolled in the class. This question raises a definitional issue under FERPA, which is what is an education record under FERPA. Under FERPA, education records are defined, with certain exceptions, as those records that are 1, directly related to a student, and 2, maintained by an educational agency or institution, or by a party acting on their behalf. Video recordings of virtual classroom lessons qualify as education records only if they directly relate to a student and are maintained by an educational agency or institution. FERPA's non-disclosure provisions may still apply if the video recordings contain PII from student education records with respect to that third party. You may want to look at your vendor agreements to determine whether the video recordings will be or will not be maintained as education records beyond the period of instruction. In general, if the purpose of the recording is only to make it available for other students who may have missed that period or particular class, then the recording will not be maintained, generally FERPA would not apply. Some of the implications or considerations for a video recording of a virtual classroom is that if it will be maintained as an education record, it will implicate FERPA and therefore implicate the 3 major rights: the rights of access, the right of consent, and the right to seek amendment of those records. And please also note that if a recording contains PII for multiple students, then it is more complicated. But in general, most virtual classrooms provided for instruction purposes only that don't contain PII from education records and are not maintained as education records would not fall under FERPA's requirements. Some questions to consider are: will the video recording be maintained as an education record, and is it directly related to a student? Another consideration is what, if any, PII from education records did the video recordings capture? The third question is: with whom is the school sharing the video recording? And finally, how is the school protecting any unauthorized disclosure of video recordings that qualify as education records?
Our school is closed, but a parent has requested access to his or her child's education record. What steps can we take to meet the 45-day timeline for access to education records under FERPA?
So under FERPA, the school generally must provide a parent with the opportunity to inspect or review his or her child's education records within 45 days of the receipt of a request. And similarly for eligible students, there's a 45-day right in post-secondary institutions. While required to provide the right of access to education records, a school in general is not required under FERPA to provide copies of those records. However, we have said in the past, if circumstances effectively would prevent a parent or eligible student from exercising his or her right to inspect and review education records, the school would be required to provide a copy or make other arrangements that would allow for the inspection and review of the records. One of the examples we had before virtual learning came along is a situation where a parent doesn't live within commuting distance of the school. The ability to provide a copy in the virtual environment or to make other arrangements is helpful. FERPA does not have specific exception in the statute or regulation of a school to not comply with the request to inspect or review a record. However, we recommend that schools consider what alternatives there exist for the inspection and review right. First, how is your school or school district handling other administrative functions? While schools are closed to students in this time of social distancing, some administrative functions continue at the school. And if it's open for limited hours, if that's an option, that's one to consider. The second is, can your school provide electronic access or make an electronic copy available of the requested education record and email it or mail it to the parent? A third consideration, given social distancing and physical contact restrictions, is to just have schools and parents work together to identify mutually agreeable options that work for both the parent and for the school.
Our college requires that students come in to sign consent forms for disclosure of their education records. With schools closed, we are unable to have students come in. Is it okay to obtain consent using electronic?
Yes, FERPA permits electronic consent. FERPA's written consent requirement was clarified to permit that a signed and dated written consent under FERPA must specify the records that are to be disclosed or may be disclosed, to identify or state the purpose of the disclosure, and identify the party or class of parties to whom the disclosure would be made. And that consent can include a record and signature in electronic form that meets the two standards. One, it identifies and authenticates a particular person as the source of the electronic consent. And two, it indicates that person's approval of the information contained in the electronic consent. For example, if there is an email already on file for a parent or an eligible student, that email can be used as a form of communication. The consent, if that email is not on file, then the school will want to think of what ways it can use to determine the authenticity of the email address. Some questions to consider for this scenario are, does the school have a standard consent form under FERPA, and is that available electronically? Second, does the school include a general description identifying the education records to be disclosed, the parties to whom disclosure will occur, and the purpose, as that is the information that needs to be included in any consent? And the third, as I mentioned earlier, how do you authenticate the identity of an individual if an email is not already on file? And one option is to ask for other information to verify who that individual is based on the information you already have on the student.
I'm working from home. I'm a college professor and would like to have a conference with an eligible student to discuss an assignment. Or I may be a public school teacher and would like to conduct a parent-student conference. My spouse is also at home and in the same room. Is it all right if I conduct the conference?
Yes, provided one of three things. As long as the teacher or professor does not disclose PII from the student's education record in the hearing of his or her spouse during the conversation, it is fine. Second, if the teacher or professor moves away from his or her spouse to discuss PII from the student's education records so that the spouse does not overhear the discussion, that would be fine as well. Or as a final alternative, if there really is no choice and everyone is literally at close quarters, which we understand. The teacher or professor can request and obtain prior consent in electronic form from the parent or eligible student for the potential disclosure of PII from the student's education record to his or her spouse. Some questions to consider is how the conference will occur. Will it be a phone call or video call? And what privacy protections can be put into place based on that, perhaps using earbuds or headphones, so as to limit the information that will be overheard. A second consideration is what is the subject of the conference. Most often, if you are reviewing subject matter instruction as a teacher or professor, the substance of biology or math generally does not involve PII from a student's education record and does not implicate FERPA. Finally, another consideration is what precautions you can put into place to make sure your spouse does not overthrow the conversation. We have known people who have stepped literally outside to be able to complete their conversation.
Colleges received notice from an admissions council that their practices have changed during the COVID-19 pandemic, and the admissions council will accept student transcripts via email. Are colleges required to use secure transmission of PII by fax or email encryption software to transmit non-directory information via email? What is the information security standard under?
As I mentioned earlier, FERPA does not have an explicit information security standard, as it is a privacy, not an information security law. There are ways to secure PII, or personally identifiable information, in student education records that are transmitted with email, such as encrypting attachments. The availability of encryption is pretty common in most business email programs. It may be less commonly known in personal email. Other best practice ways to share files include secure file transfer protocols. There is a PTAC video on our website, the link to it is on this handout of this slide, that identifies some of these and other best practices.
Under FERPA, may the school or school district identify that a student has COVID-19 to parents of other students in the school when the student has been out of the school during the entire period of possible transmission and the school does not release the name.
So this question comes up from our frequently asked questions, or FAQ document, which was the first document that the Student Privacy Policy Office issued regarding COVID-19 and FERPA. And there are many other questions also in that document. In this question, part of the reason we were asked this question is that we are now at a time where schools have been closed or are closing, and the period of transmission may have passed. Yet schools have identified this as an area where they would still like to communicate with parents, recognizing that the students and parents in their communities live in close proximity to one another and may encounter one another. So they've asked this question because it still is coming up. And the answer is, it depends, but generally yes. But only if that information is in a non-personally identifiable form. An educational agency or institution must make a reasonable determination that a student's identity is not personally identifiable, whether through single or multiple releases, and taking into account other reasonably available information. The citation you see there is to our definition of personally identifiable information. In most cases, schools do not need to reveal the name or identity of students who are diagnosed with COVID-19. In fact, our guidance document that is there on the bottom of that slide confirms that in most instances, that is certainly not information that the public would need to know. And in very rare and limited circumstances, would you have even the need to reveal that information to health officials or other individuals. If the educational agency or institution discloses information about students in non-personally identifiable form, then consent by parents or eligible students generally is not needed under FERPA because it does not implicate FERPA. You can see the answers to this question and other related questions in the FERPA and coronavirus disease COVID-19 FAQ document at the bottom of the page. While information security is not part of FERPA, there are some best practices to consider to determine how best to protect student privacy. As you look at different education platforms or expand existing ones, look at first what your school or district already uses. As you look at current solutions, you may find that existing educational platforms where you have relationships already and agreements may include features that can be leveraged to support distance learning during this time. The second consideration is to look at what options you have and to make sure that you consult both with your attorneys to get legal advice and your information security specialist, whether that's your CIO or your CISO, to vet prospective solutions against a number of requirements, only one of which is FERPA. And using a risk-based approach, consider the advice from both of those professionals. Some of the things to look for are products that apply best practices such as encryption, strong identity authentication, and include statements and terms of services that explain how the vendor's use of PII from student education records complies with FERPA, including FERPA's provisions regarding non-redisclosure of PII. A fourth consideration is to be open, transparent, and communicate often with parents, students in your school community, both about the distance learning, the methods, the schedule, as well as the platforms that you will be using. Finally, feel free to ask for help. In addition to speaking with your attorneys and information security specialists and your peers, we here at the Student Privacy Policy Office and the Privacy Technical Assistance Center are happy to provide technical assistance on FERPA and related data and student privacy issues. I wanted to highlight a number of other resources that are available at the end of this PowerPoint presentation. The first are some federal agency COVID-19 resources. The primary agency that is the most information on the health and other information directly on COVID-19 is the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control. Their main website is the first website identified on this slide. The second website is the U.S. Department of Education, where we have set up a specific part of our website to include additional guidance specific to this time during the COVID-19 pandemic. It includes guidance not just from our office, the Student Privacy Policy Office, but also our offices who work in the K-12 space, our Office of Elementary and Secondary Education, our Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, our Office of Civil Rights, as well as our post-secondary institution guidance documents from the Office of Post-Secondary Education and our Office of Undersecretary. It includes information about some of the waivers under the ETSA, as well as other information, and we will continue to update it, so please check back. In addition, earlier today in the slide presentation, I mentioned some of the documents issued under the HIPAA, which is administered by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And you see the third resource there, contact or the website for that information. In addition, I mentioned two FERPA and COVID-19 related resources that our office has put out. As I mentioned in the early days, the FERPA and Coronavirus Disease 2019 or COVID FAQ document discusses the many aspects of the health or safety emergency exception under FERPA in the context of COVID-19. Second, we had put together a quick one-page resource list that provides links to and a compilation of some of the SPPO and PTAC resources on virtual learning, some of which we have reviewed today. In addition, some of you have asked us some general questions about FERPA, and we have information on our website, including FERPA training modules, further information on the school official exception, and general policies for users of student data, and a checklist. There are other checklists, including data incidents or breaches that you may also find on the FERPA website, and that website is studentprivacy.ed.gov. As I mentioned, some of the virtual learning related FERPA resources include 2 documents on protecting student privacy while using online education services. The first are just a review of the FERPA requirements and best practices. I spoke today about the school official exception. That document contains some other scenarios that would be helpful. The second document on that page is a checklist of potential model terms of service if schools are still looking at establishing agreements with online educational apps for virtual learning. In addition, there's a section of our student privacy website that includes information on security best practices, on email and video practices, as well as other FAQs or frequently asked questions on photos and videos that might be useful. Before I get to the conclusion, I just wanted to say a few words. I want to thank you for taking the time today to learn more about FERPA, and more importantly, to thank you for all you are doing to learn and continue your work to support our students during this time. We ask your help in supporting the privacy work of the department by amplifying our messages here at the Student Privacy Policy Office and our FERPA guidance, as we all work together to build flexibility and resiliency with our educational partners to support our educators in making education available to students at the K-12 and post-secondary level. The Student Privacy Policy Office is available to respond to questions that you or others may have about FERPA. As mentioned earlier, you may email ferpa@ed.gov for questions. Please take good care of yourself, your family, and friends and neighbors and others, so that we may get through this together as a stronger society and learn from our efforts during this time. Be well. With that, I'm turning the webinar back to Sean at PTAC.
Kala and Ross, thank you both for reviewing those questions and providing insightful technical assistance resources on FERPA and virtual learning during COVID-19. The recording of this webinar will be made available along with a copy of the slide deck. Please refer to the studentprivacy.ed.gov website. If you have any questions that were not addressed on today's call, please direct them to ferpa@ed.gov or by phone at 855-249-3072. With that, thank you for your attendance and have a great rest of your day.